Hey y'all, today I want to show you my current endgame setup on my Barbarian. This is an update to my updated Upheaval guide that I posted about a couple weeks ago now. I want to show you kind of where I landed with the build, the choices I made on the skill tree, some gear changes and things like that. I will have a section later on in the video as well that will talk about some alternatives to the build, some other options you can make during a skill tree and in gearing. I've had questions about Hammer the Ancients or using on like a different key passive at the bottom of the skill tree, things like that. So I'll go over that stuff later on at the end. You can check the timestamps in the description or in the video player. Otherwise, we'll get just right into it. So this build playstyle is a weapon swapping related playstyle. We use Lunging Strike, Upheaval, and Deathblow for all of our damage. And with the way I have it set up currently, we actually do use every single one of the weapons. I think this is a pretty neat aspect of Barbarian, that they have this sort of master of arms sort of power fantasy using all these different melee weapons. So I wanted to play into that when I was making this build originally. I do want to preface before I really kind of deep dive into the build overall is that this is not a secret OP meta build. It's not going to one shot the Echo of Lilith. It's not going to clear a Nightmare 2 or 100 dungeon in 5 seconds, right? It's not this super crazy OP build that no one's ever thought of, right? It's just something that I've kind of stumbled my way into, and it has been quite successful for me through basically the majority of my leveling in terms of time. Almost all of my World Tier 3 and World Tier 4 leveling has been using some variation of this build, so I found quite a lot of success with it myself, and I would like to just share that all with you. But I don't want to imply that this is somehow better than the meta Barbarian setups with Whirlwind and Hammer the Ancients and things like that. I'm not going to claim that it's any better than those, but I think this does work though, and if you're doing content that's on your level or slightly above your level, I think this build works very well in my opinion, and it's quite fun to play. It's very active. It's not like Hammer the Ancients and the Whirlwind stuff where you kind of just have triple shouts and your Wrath of the Berserker and you just have everything funnel into one button and you just use that one button. That's basically it. The different attacks that you're using really helps make it feel a lot more active of a playstyle, and I enjoy it a lot more myself. So anyway, as for the gear, for the helmet, we gain damage reduction for each nearby enemy up to 20% maximum. We will be bleeding enemies basically all the time with every attack, so just kind of a free 20% damage reduction. For the chest piece, another free damage reduction. Basic skills grant 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. We are going to be using Lunging Strike quite frequently. There's a number of reasons for doing that, and this is one of them. We get some extra damage reduction. The stats on the gear, as I go over them, there could always be better versions. I have a video talking about stats, but it's mainly just, you want crit, you want vulnerable, you want main stat. For defensives, you want damage reduction. The additive extra stats like core skill damage, damage to close enemies, damage to injured enemies, damage to crowd control, those are all good also, but you definitely still want to focus on crit and vulnerable damage for this build, especially because our death blow is going to attempt to high roll damage very often. As for the gloves, attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill up to 30%. This just makes our upheaval more powerful when we use it. Our main source of damage is definitely going to be from Deathblow and Upheaval. It's not purely a Deathblow build, it's not purely an Upheaval build, it's a mixture of both, and they both serve different purposes in the playstyle. For the pants, we have the aspect where you gain a stacking armor bonus up to 50%. This is a very strong legendary aspect. It's just you gain a bunch of armor, and armor is very good, so kind of a no-brainer. Most builds are going to be picking up this legendary aspect because it's very strong for your defensive stats. For the boots, we're going to be using the aspect where you gain an extra charge on your weapon mastery skills. This is half a quality of life change for Deathblow to have 2 charges, as you can see down here. But it also enables a couple neat little combo plays that you can make on bosses and other things like that. So this is a really fun aspect to have. The lucky hit chance to stun is kind of a freebie. It's not something we really interact with very much, but it's just nice to have. It's there For our two-handed bludgeoning weapon, we have the Edgemaster's effect, or aspect. Skills do up to 40% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. We will be generating quite a lot of Fury. We don't really have too many Fury problems, mainly because we are going to be weapon swapping so frequently that we're not going to be just spamming Upheaval. We're not just going to be spamming Deathblow, right? So the odds of you running out of Fury are not impossible, right? It can still happen, but we have ways to mitigate the frequent use of Upheaval, so we don't really have too many Fury problems. For our one-handed weapons, we're going to have the Berserk Ripping aspect. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, you inflict a percentage of that damage as bleeding. This is going to be our main source of bleeding for the build, which synergizes, with this damage reduction to bleeding enemies, as well as damage to bleeding enemies. For our other one-handed weapon, we're going to have critical strikes with core skills increase our attack speed. This just makes the build flow a lot smoother. Upheaval has a fairly slow animation time by default, so having more attack speed makes the animation faster for Upheaval, and it just makes the build flow a bit smoother. For our amulet, we have the Limitless Rage aspect. Each point of Fury you generate while at maximum Fury grants your next core skill bonus damage up to 45% bonus damage. The amulet gives a 50% bonus for the aspects that are put on it, so this goes up to 45%. This is just another way to buff Upheaval because we don't want all of our damage to be in Upheaval and we don't want all of it to be in Deathblow. We're kind of having both of them deal pretty good damage. For our ring, we're going to be using the Berserk Fury aspect. You gain Fury while berserking. We are going to be berserking essentially 24/7, so we have a permanent 6 Fury per second, which is nice to have. And for the last ring, we have basic skills gain attack speed. Just a freebie to have. We are using Lunging Strike quite frequently, so it is just a nice thing to have. A lot of attack speed. And for sort of the pinnacle, really important aspect, I would say one of the most important aspects for this build and playstyle specifically, it's going to be the Encroaching Wrath. I talked about this in my last build guide on how important this is. You gain an absolute gargantuan damage bonus after spending 100 Fury for your next weapon mastery skill, which includes Deathblow. Since it is on my two-handed weapon, it goes up to 200% increased damage. Not 100%, 200%. That's a lot. Deathblow can hit very hard. It is not going to be hitting, hundreds of millions of damage or anything like that, but it's enough to kill most elites in one hit, and you can even sometimes one-shot bosses under the right circumstances. So definitely a huge power multiplier for your Deathblow. For our expertise, we're going to be using the two-handed axe expertise. Gives us increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Previously, I did suggest using the two-handed sword expertise, but since we are going to be using the Berserk Ripping aspect, which gives us our bleeding anyway, we don't really need an extra source of bleeding, so we're better off getting the extra damage bonus to vulnerable enemies, which will be true for all of our weapons instead of just axes. It's important to note for this build as well that you actually have each of your damaging abilities set to the correct weapon type. On PC, if you hit S, it'll pull up the skills menu here. You can also do it from the abilities menu if that's also open. But if you hover over each of your damaging abilities, you can actually select which weapon that skill will use. The big one that you're going to base everything around is going to be Deathblow. I set this to automatically select the best choice for the most amount of damage that Deathblow will give me. It's either going to be your two-handed sword or a two-handed bludgeoning weapon. And the way this is going to work is whatever Deathblow is set to, your Upheaval will be set to your other two-handed option. So since my Deathblow is set to my two-handed bludgeoning weapon, I'm going to set my Upheaval to my two-handed slashing weapon. This helps with the weapon swap damage bonus as well as the Walking Arsenal key passive. And for your Lunging Strike, I select the Do-Wield option, which helps increase its attack speed as well. The damage of Lunging Strike is not really the important part, but we need a way to use both of our both of our one-handed weapons in the build somehow. So that's where I use that. So change your skills. You can actually set which weapon type each of your skills will use. Next, we will talk about our skill tree. This is not too different from the last build video, like I have mentioned. We're going to be using Lunging Strike, picking up Enhanced Lunging Strike, and then Combat Lunging Strike for the chance to Berserk when we crit. We're going to pick up Upheaval, of course. We're going to be picking up Violent Upheaval as our option. I think Furious Upheaval is okay, but we're using Upheaval too often to really make a lot of value out of this. I'd rather have the extra source of Berserking. We're going to pick up Rally Cry. This is going to be our source of Unstoppable. This is very important for higher tier, higher level content. You can get CC chained very easily in this game. You can get stun, frozen, chilled, slowed, knocked down, and then you're dead. So having a source of Unstoppable is very important to have. Then we'll pick up Strategic Rally Cry, which is going to be one of our main sources of Fortify. We are going to be fortified almost all the time in this build with the help of the Paragon board. So we are going to be using this as well as a source for Fortify. Pick up Warcry, damage buff, really nice to have, as well as the Mighty Warcry, which gives us even more Fortify when we use it. We're going to be picking up all 3 shout passives because they're just really strong and we are using 2 shouts. We're going to pick up 1 point in aggressive resistance so that we can get 3 points into Prolific Fury. So while berserking, our Fury generation is increased, which is nice because we are going to be berserking basically all the time. One of our other critical skills, of course, is going to be Death Blow. Enhanced Death Blow and then into Warrior Death Blow for another source of berserking. I think either of these choices here are fine. I prefer the berserking uptime, but the raw fury that you get out of this is definitely kind of nice to have. Especially if you don't have a lot of ways to proc berserking, maybe if you're like trying to level with the build or something like that. We're going to pick up these 3 passives up here. The Pit Fighter increases our damage to close enemies and we gain distant damage reduction. Pretty good. You have increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. Pretty good. Because we're going to be putting 1 point and hamstring, every enemy we every enemy we bleed are slowed, sorry. And with the berserk ripping aspect, and the fact that we're going to be berserking basically all the time, means that enemies are going to be slowed. So we have increased crit chance against basically everything we hit. Pretty nice. And then we're going to have exposed vulnerability. Dealing direct damage with a weapon master skill causes your next core skill to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. This is a nice to have, since our only other way of proccing vulnerability is going to be from the exploit glyph on the Paragon board, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is nice to have when you don't actually kill something within that brief window from the exploit glyph's vulnerability duration. So this is an extra nice thing to have. Ever since switching to this, the build has felt a bit more consistent. Whenever things don't always go your way, if you don't kill things immediately, it's nice to have an extra backup source for vulnerability. We're going to pick up 1 point Thick Skin, just a little bit of extra Fortify, but really it's so that we can get counteroffensive, so that we get an extra 12% increased damage when we have more than 50% of our life as Fortify, and we're going to have a lot of Fortify with this current playstyle. For the ultimate, I'm going to go with Iron Maelstrom. Again, this is a weapon swap base build, and this synergizes very well with the Supreme Iron Maelstrom effect, where we gain a reduced cooldown of 1 second for Iron Maelstrom every time we swap weapons, which is basically all the time. So even though this has a 55-second cooldown, it's actually more like 25 to 30 seconds on average, since we're weapon swapping that frequently. Very nice to have. This is basically a screen clearing button. It just does a huge amount of damage to essentially everything on the screen, so pretty good in my opinion. I have 3 points in heavy-handed from my amulet, so I just put 1 extra point in here. This gives us more critical strike damage with 2-handed weapons, and our upheaval is going to be using our 2-handed sword in my case, and our death blow is going to be using my 2-handed bludgeoning weapon. So both of our main damaging abilities have 20% crit damage. Pretty good. And then we're going to have Wallop, so our bludgeoning weapons deal increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. This is mainly for our death blow, since my death blow is going to be using my 2-handed bludgeoning weapon. So they just get 15% more damage, even better for death blow. And for the key passive, we're going to have Walking Arsenal. This is a stacking damage bonus for using each of your weapon types as a barbarian. And when you have all 3 of them active, you gain an additional 15% increased damage. Pretty nice overall. Again, I have gotten questions about Unconstrained. I'm going to have a section later on in the video where I talk about this, but for now, I'm just going to go over what I'm using now, which is Walking Arsenal. As for the Paragon board, this is my current setup. I'll go over all of it. For leveling, like early Paragon levels, I'm going to suggest that you put the exploit glyph in your starter board. I don't have that currently. I have it over here in my current setup. But the exploit glyph is going to be a huge power spike when you can get that additional bonus. So when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, and it has a 20-second cooldown per enemy. This is a massive damage bonus, at least for my build, because I don't have a way to proc vulnerable outside of exposing vulnerability. So having this as an extra source of vulnerable is extremely nice to have. I switch exploit over to this glyph socket over here in my current Paragon setup because there's more dexterity available on this board here as compared to the starter board, and you get a scaling amount of vulnerable damage for every point of dexterity that you have. But as for my starting board, I ended up going to the right here, picking up that rare node. I put in Blood Feeder, getting damage to bleeding enemies, as well as increase critical strike chance against bleeding enemies. Grab both of these rare nodes, pick up all the dexterity that we can in the starter board. I'm going to connect the Blood Rage as my first board. I'm going to be using the Ire glyph, damage while berserking, and while berserking we gain a 10% damage reduction from elites. I initially went over to the right here, came down to grab the damage to bleeding and damage to elites. Picked up the damage while berserking, damage to elites, as well as the Carnage node. While berserking, your crits will give you attack speed. Just a nice bonus to attack speed. Feels pretty good to have. And like I said, I ended up putting the exploit glyph in here after I managed to get enough Paragon points to get all of the dexterity nodes that I'm looking for. If you were still working through the Paragon board, I would just switch these two. I would put exploit in the first starter board down here, and then I would put the Blood Feeder over here. This is what I was doing for a while, but eventually I made the swap so that the exploit glyph was over here to get more access to dexterity nodes. Path down just to grab some more damage while berserking and berserk duration. We're going to come up and we're going to pick up the Decimator board. I don't really care about the legendary node itself, but I liked some of the rare nodes that were available. Gonna path over, grab some physical damage and max life, just kind of a freebie. We're gonna end up using Mortal Draw, so we gain a pretty big damage bonus. Well, 2 skills that swap to new weapons, and since we're weapon swapping essentially all the time, we have a nice juicy damage buff here. As well as swapping weapons has a 18% chance to cause the skill's damage to critically strike, which is really nice. Just basically free crit chance whenever you're swapping weapons. And since we're swapping weapons all the time, this is really nice to have. You can definitely feel the 18% extra crit overall in the build, for sure. And as we're pathing into that glyph node, we're going to pick up the vulnerable damage, which is really good because vulnerable damage is very good. And then we're going to have just some damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. Just a nice thing to have. And since it's part of the glyph socket radius, it's pretty easy to path to. The way my current Paragon board is set up is that I actually have like 2 branching paths on the Paragon board. So from my first additional board, the Blood Rage board, I ended up pathing up, grabbing the damage while berserking, berserk duration rare node, and then I pathed up to the glyph socket, and I picked up the Might glyph in here. Gives us physical damage, as well as an increased damage bonus when wielding 2-handed weapons. Just a nice freebie to have. I'm also going to pick up the physical damage node here as well. Bring your path up and over to grab this rare node, which is kind of just on the way. And this is going to be our huge source of Fortify. So every time we spend 75 Fury, we gain 12% of our max life as Fortify. This essentially means every other Upheaval will give you a nice chunk of Fortify, since Upheaval has a 40 Fury cost by default, so 40 times 2 is 8. So every other Upheaval, you gain a bunch of Fortify, which is really nice to have. I don't need to worry about having Fortify sources on my legendary aspects on my gear. I can get most of all of my Fortify from this legendary node and my shouts. And we ended up going with the damage roll fortified and fortified duration, or fortified generation. Speak right now. I'm level 95, like I have mentioned before, so there are still more Paragon nodes to go pick up. Namely, I'm on my way to picking up this rare node over here that's on the Decimator board. This gives us damage with 2-handed slashing weapons, as well as another source of vulnerable damage. And there's a couple other magic nodes here that give us more vulnerable damage, which is pretty good. I will have a build link in the description that I'm going to have the planned full Paragon board with every node or every Paragon point allocated, so you can see kind of what I'm going to be planning for every single point if you want to see the full board. Next, I wanted to talk about some variants and other options you can make for the build. I've gotten questions about, does this work with Hammer the Ancients? Does this work with this thing? Does it work with that thing? So I kind of want to mention a few of them here in the video that are from some specific things that I have been asked about before. One of them, like I said, is can you use Hammer of the Ancients? And the answer is probably yes. I don't see a reason why you wouldn't be able to use Hammer of the Ancients with this build if you wanted to do so. I would definitely go ahead and pick up the legendary aspect somewhere on your gear that gives you the shockwave bonus effect on Hammer of the Ancients. I would definitely pick that up. I don't see why this wouldn't, be a viable option, but I'm gonna go with Upheaval just because I like Upheaval, and that's basically it. I like Upheaval, so I'm using Upheaval. The other big question I've been asked numerous times is, what about Unconstrained? So Unconstrained increases your Berserk's maximum duration by 5 seconds and increases its damage bonus by an extra 25%. I think either of these options are very valid. Walking Arsenal is a bit more active in the playstyle in that you're trying to maximize the damage bonus that you get from Walking Arsenal. But Unconstrained is just way simpler to use. It's just, you don't have to think about it. You just get an extra freebie 25% to the Berserk damage bonus. And since Berserk will have a longer duration, it means that you will actually have the Berserk's movement speed more often, more than like while you're playing the game. So I think either of these choices are totally fine. I've used them both, and they both feel pretty close to each other in terms of their strength. So if you really want to be in that like weapon swapping kind of playstyle, there's Walking Arsenal. But if you want to just not really think about all that and just use Unconstrained, I think this is a totally fine passive to pick up. I've heard some people asking about the Overkill, which is a unique two-handed hammer. Gives your death blow the shockwave, and if your shockwave kills anything, it also resets your death blow cooldown. I would love to tell you if it's good, or if I like using it for this build, if I had it. I don't have it yet. I'm level 95. I've done so many dungeon runs. I've done quite a number of nightmare dungeons. In fact, almost all of my glyphs in my Paragon board that I'm using are currently level 21. Blood Feeder, Exploit, Might, and my Mortal Draw are level 21, and then I'm working on my Ire glyph to being 21 as well. I've done quite a number of nightmare dungeons specifically, and I still cannot get this unique hammer to drop, so I cannot comment on it. I would love to give it a try, but currently I cannot do that. So would love to give you feedback on that, but I can't, so feels bad. Anyway, that is the general overview of the build setup. I had shown some regular dungeon footage in the past. I'm going to be adding a no commentary clip of of a nightmare dungeon, a higher tier nightmare dungeon above my level, and just running through that, giving you a feel for the build and how it plays. So there will be that for you guys to watch. Otherwise, I appreciate you all for supporting me and my sort of brief foray into YouTube content as of late. I am very humbled by the positive responses that I've gotten both on YouTube and on my Twitch stream, which you can watch live whenever I am streaming. I do read pretty much all the comments, more or less, whenever I can for the videos I put up. So if you have questions, feel free to ask down below. Otherwise, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.
ready yet.